representatives from the United States Air Force Academy, and it's going to be our presentation on the Spies in the Hanoi Hilton case. I'm Cadet Third Class Jacob Teresi.
I'm Cadet First Class Brianna Barnett.
I'm Cadet Second Class Mackenzie Blue.
And I'm Cadet Second Class Ashay Stephen.
Excellent. Now 30 minutes to give your presentation, and then followed by 20 minutes of question and answer by the judges. So once you start speaking, I'll start the timer.
Thank you.
All right, so getting into it, this is going to serve as the framework that our presentation will follow, and we're going to use a conjunction of moral as well as legal theories to answer two prevailing questions. The first of which being, did the United States government have the moral obligation to enter into these clandestine communications with the POWs? And further, did the POW leadership have a moral and legal right to engage and continue engaging in these communications with the United States government? So as some background, these American POWs are being held in the Kuala prison, and that's otherwise known as the Hanoi Hilton. After communications with his wife, Commander Stockdale revealed through coded writing that there was torture at the Hanoi Hilton. And in response, the Central Intelligence Agency worked with his wife, Sybil, to send a communique to him at the prison, which he then interpreted through the means of soaking it in water, and thus began this communication chain back and forth. And through this communication, the POWs were able to give information to the government, such as bomb targets and other intelligence, as well as devise a plan to escape and free the rest of the POWs that were there. So moving forward, the main stakeholders for the case are going to be the POWs, of course, the Central Intelligence Agency, North Vietnamese government, the Department of Defense, and any American allies in the war. And when we say United States government from here on out, it's going to be an umbrella term that will encompass the Central Intelligence Agency as well as the Department of Defense. So our main argument is going to focus on these two answers, and that is that it was morally and legally permissible for the United States government to engage in these communications, given the fact that they had reasonable chance to suspect that the POWs were being tortured. However, they did not have an obligation to continue to get information that did not directly support this escape effort. As for the POW leadership themselves, they had the moral obligation to engage in these communications and continue doing so, again, for that purpose of escape. However, they didn't have that obligation in terms of other information for military operations.
So here we're going to be looking at the actions of the U.S. government, and we're going to be looking at the balance that the U.S. government had of moral obligations to aid the POWs in escape while also limiting the harm done to them. So here you have U.S. government obligations. In the case that the U.S. government had no knowledge of the conditions of the prison that they were in, then the U.S. government had no moral obligation to take action and participate in communications that would potentially put the POWs at more risk. However, if there was knowledge of inhumane treatment, which we saw after Stockdale's first letter home to his wife Sybil, there was knowledge that there was torture occurring in the prison that they were being held in. So then we're going to look over here on the left to information not directly related to escape was unjustified because it puts the POWs in an increased risk of harm based on the information that they were gathering, and I will talk about that in a little bit. However, looking on the right side, that the escape was justified if the communications were used for merely to aid the prisoners of war to escape. So we are going to be looking at the U.S. moral obligations through multiple theoretical lenses. On the first lens that we're going to be looking at is prima facie duties. So a prima facie duty is a duty which we are obliged to follow unless another duty may outweigh that case. So for the example, you look at the classical example of we should not lie. However, if I were to be holding a Jewish man and keeping him safe from a Nazi that were coming to my door, the prima facie duty would say it's not right to lie. However, I should lie because I want to protect someone else's life. So that's the idea of prima facie duty. And in the case of the U.S. government, prima facie duty that they have is to not partake in actions which might cause more harm to the POWs. However, that is outweighed by the fact that the POWs were already in a state of harm, and the U.S. government had the ability to help partake in actions that would aid prisoners of war and finding means to escape. We're going to look at the practical imperative now, developed by Kant, describing that one must not use another person for a mere means. And this, going back to the flow chart, is going to demonstrate why the U.S. government should not use the prisoners of war as a means to gain military advantage and gather more information, because it puts them at more risk and is using them for military ends, rather than respecting the humanity of the prisoner of war itself. So now here's a flow chart demonstrating the POW actions. So we're going to look at the top POWs. POWs have an obligation to prevent harm and escape, as claimed in the Code of Conduct in Articles 3 and 4. We're going to look at the far right side of POWs. Maintaining POW status basically means that they did not participate in any clandestine communications or any participate in espionage, which would have moved them over to the status of losing the status of POWs. So in their POW status, as stated in Stockdale's first letter, they were still receiving harm and torture by the North Vietnamese captors, so they were already at a risk of harm, and they were not gaining any additional chance of success for escape. Moving on to spies, this is once they have participated in espionage or any clandestine communications, they lose the rights of being the non-prisoner of war, or being a prisoner of war and non-combatant immunity. So here on the far left, we have providing information for military means. This will put additional risk of harm on the prisoners of war, which is unnecessary, and again, I'll talk about that in a little bit. So the middle column is what we're going to be looking at for the right action. Providing information for escape provides justified risk of harm, as there is that balance between Articles 3 and 4 of providing means of escape, while also limiting the amount of harm that would come to prisoners of war and their comrades. So one moral theory that we're going to be looking at for the POW actions is consequentialism. Consequentialism is looks at the morality of actions through the lens of the results that follow the actions. So part of this is utilitarianism, developed by Mill, and he focuses on the greatest happiness principle. Common definition for happiness is pleasure in the absence of pain. So we're going to be looking here at these boxes at the bottom. This follows along and supports the flow chart that I just spoke about. So on the left hand, or on the right hand, we have providing no information. If you look at the consequences and the results of the actions, there is no increased chance of escape while they maintain a status of being harmed in prisons. Looking on the left side, providing information for military means and escape. So we have increased risk of harm for providing information for escape, but also increased risk of harm for spying and providing information that does not directly correlate to their escape plans. And here we have a reasonable chance of success. However, due to increasing risk, that does not increase the chance of success as well. So that maintains stable. And that same successful escape attempt reasonability would come in this middle column, which we develop as the right course of action, is providing information for escape, providing information for risk of escape. You have that risk in there, but it's the balance of Articles 3 and 4 of maintaining, trying to escape the prison while also limiting the harm that would come to others. And we see this on page 10 of the case, if we're looking at the articles, how POW senior leadership imposed a policy stipulating that no escape plan would be approved without a high likelihood of success, and the assurance of outside assistance. So maintaining that communication, but for the means of escape.
On now to leadership duties and considerations. These come from the military norms, culture, and the Uniform Code of Military Justice. A primary duty is not to put undue harm or increased harm to your fellow comrades when a POW. Therefore, the leadership had an obligation to exhibit due care and to minimize harm to their POWs. Through providing information that was extraneous to their escape attempt, they were putting potentially more harm on their POWs. Therefore, they violated this. After the failed escape attempt by Dramessi and Kessler, you saw punitive action taken onto their fellow POWs. Therefore, they had the duty to only establish an escape attempt if it had a reasonable chance of success. they did not necessarily have as much of a duty to the mission as a whole, to the military mission as a whole, because they were considered non-combatants and it had non-combatant status. Therefore, once taken prisoner, you do not have, you're not contributing to direct war efforts. Considerations: through providing information that was extraneous to an escape attempt, they waived their rights to non-combatant status, therefore putting themselves at possible loss of life or limb. But we say that Stockdale maintained the structure and the rank order within the camps, and therefore that helped to establish efficient communications, as well as establish routes that had a reasonable chance to let them escape. Therefore, he upkept all of his leadership duties. Now on to just war ethics. We're specifically looking at use and bellow principles because those are the principles you use during times of war. The first principle is discrimination. This is the difference between a non-combatant and a combatant. Like I said, the prisoners waived their non-combatant status when they provided information extraneous to an escape attempt. This means that they waived their rights to non-combatant status. We say that this is minimal in effect because the North Vietnamese were not acknowledging the difference between a combatant and a non-combatant in the Hanoi Hilton. Therefore, this is not a large part of the case. However, looking at proportionality, the U.S. had an ethical obligation to go about gathering information, let's say about bomb targets or information about military operations in means that provide the smallest amount of harm to their people. Therefore, we say that the U.S. violated proportionality because they could have gone about getting this information in other ways that did not put the POWs at harm.
So we talked at length about the moral side of what these POWs should do. So now it's time to look at it from a legal perspective. So the Code of Conduct is a document that kind of enshrines how a U.S. military member should behave, specifically while they're a POW. So Article 3 is one of note, and it says that a POW should make every effort to escape. However, in Article 4, we see that a POW should not take part in any action which might be harmful to my comrades. So there's a potential for conflict here, because on one hand, we're supposed to be making every effort to escape if we're a POW. But on the other hand, we don't want to put people in harm's way for no reason, right? We don't want to bring them harmful actions that the North Vietnamese and their captors might inflict on them. So for example, in the case, we see how Stockdale saw that there was a failed escape attempt, and Stockdale knew that after that failed escape attempt, the North Vietnamese engaged in punitive action against all the prisoners, not just those who escaped. They were trying to get information about the escape, who was involved, who were they communicating with. So that's how these two things can conflict. So how do we deconflict the two? We can look at this from a nice quote from General George Davis here. And he says, "We should be making every effort to escape. However, it is the duty of a prisoner of war to escape whenever an opportunity presents itself that offers a reasonable prospect of success." The key word is reasonable here, because that means we're not making every reckless escape attempt. We are being calculated. We are using good risk assessment and decision making, and all these skills that the senior commanding officer in the POW camps had. The scholarship agrees with this too. So scholars say that we have a duty to resist and escape by all legitimate means available. So again, we're not being reckless. We're not being extreme in how much we're trying to escape. We're being calculated and making the right decisions. Because if you make a reckless escape attempt, that might waive all future chances of escape attempts too, and also it might harm your comrades. So now we're connecting the concepts of reasonable chance of success and possible harms to others. So this is how we deconflict those two articles. Because Article 3 is saying, okay, we have a reasonable chance of success, but that still means that there's a possibility that something goes wrong. However, it needs to outweigh that possibility. And that's why you are in accordance with Article 4 here. Because with Article 4, you want to avoid bringing undue harm to others. So this illustrates the importance of these important qualities that a commander should have. A commander should be careful. A commander should make good risk assessments, good decisions, know what the POWs are going through. These all go into the calculus that is, should we make this escape attempt or should we hold off and wait for something else? So for example, Stockdale, he heard of Germacy's failed escape attempt and the harmful actions that followed, and he concluded, if we are to try to escape again, we, one, need to have a really good shot at escaping again, and two, we need outside help, because with outside help, that gives us a far greater chance. So that's where we get into clandestine communications, because that's how you secure that outside help. So the next one is Geneva Convention. So we were looking at the Code of Conduct, and that's just for US military members, and now we're taking a look at the international law that says how should states themselves conduct war. So one particular article of note here is Article 46 of Protocol 1. Also, it's worth mentioning that the Geneva Conventions are considered international customary law. That means so many states have signed off on these conventions that even if you are a state that did not sign these, you are still held to this. This is still legally binding to you. So for example, the North Vietnamese, they didn't sign off on the Geneva Convention because North Vietnam didn't exist when the Geneva Conventions were made. However, just because they didn't sign off on it doesn't mean that they shouldn't be following it. So Article 46 of Protocol 1 says that a soldier engaging in espionage in enemy territory waives non-combatant immunity. So remember we talked about non-combatant immunity as these rights that you gain as a POW. So you are entitled to certain treatment and certain respect and care under your captors. However, if you are a spy, you are still actively in the fight, although it's indirectly, right? So therefore you waive your non-combatant immunity. That's what the conventions say. So in this case, the POWs who knowingly engaged in these operations, the ones who smuggled in radio component parts, Stockdale writing on carbon paper to his wife that went to Washington, all of these actions are espionage by definition. So by doing this, he waived his own right to non-combatant immunity, so he doesn't get that special treatment anymore. These actions are legal, so you still can be a spy if you're a prisoner of war. You just have to recognize that you're not entitled to this special care anymore, right? These actions were also legal under the DoD Law of War manual, and by that, it's not explicitly outlined that you cannot do that. So how does this apply to the Code of Conduct? Espionage activities can run the risk of bad treatment of other prisoners. So we kind of saw that with the previous escape attempt. We saw how they tried to escape and they were caught. They got over the wall, they made it a few hours into the jungle, and then they were found. And then they were brought back, they were beaten, they were tied, they were tortured. Not just them, the people who helped them, and even the people who didn't help them escape. They were all beaten and tortured for information about this. So espionage activities can run this risk of bad treatment. So that's something you have to keep in mind. Because if you're running the risk of having people completely unrelated to the escape being treated worse, then you are breaching Article 4 of the Code of Conduct, right? You are bringing harm to others. However, you are also acting in accordance with Article 3, which says you're making every escape attempt possible. Not possible, but reasonably possible, right? So that's how we balance these two. You need to have a reasonable probability of success, and you need to make sure that there's a pretty low chance or something that's worth the risk of having other people being mistreated because of this.
In summary, the leadership's use of clandestine communications was warranted in the cases where it was helping in aiding in a reasonable escape attempt. They had the responsibility to exhibit due care as to not bring an undue burden or undue harm to their fellow prisoners of war. The risk of waiving their their non-combatant status and changing it to a combatant status was minimal because the North Vietnamese were already torturing them, therefore not acknowledging the distinction between combatants and non-combatants. Furthermore, the communications used for intel gathering, we say violated the use and bellow law of proportionality. The U.S. government did have a moral obligation to initiate communications when they found out that there's torture going on. And that is what they did. Therefore, they were in accordance to all moral, ethical, and legal obligations. However, the U.S. did violate the use and bellow principle of proportionality because they could potentially gone about gathering military information that was not used in an escape attempt through other means, perhaps through military intelligence. Therefore, they were putting potentially undue harm on the prisoners of war through gathering that information. When looking at it from a utilitarian perspective, hindsight is 20/20, so now we know that those bomb targets were legitimate. However, back then, there was no way to know that those would have been successful bomb targets that would have led to a greater success of ending the war early. So the U.S. government was in violation of proportionality.
And we also looked at several moral theoretical arguments in support of this conclusion as well. We talked about prima facie duties, how the U.S. government had a duty to prevent harm. However, in the situation, when the situation called for it, there was another duty that outweighed that duty to prevent harm, and that was, to get these men home safely and to aid them in escape from a situation which was violating their human rights. We also looked at consequentialism and looking at the ending of this, the actions of the POWs. We looked at how, in one case, you could have provided more risk or made an attempt which would cause more risk, a potential risk, to your fellow POWs through providing information for escape while also providing information for military means, but having that same level of success rate as you would have if you were providing information merely for escape. And then you looked at the consequences of not even providing any information, which was having a lower chance of escape.
And finally, we'll address three main counterarguments we could see being brought against our case. The first of which being an assessment of risk. This counterargument would state that the POW leadership in issuing these communication commands and in doing any of those actions which they did, they could be held responsible for aiding and abetting the enemy should any repercussions occur to the POWs themselves. However, as upheld in US v. Olson, the leaders and anyone being charged with this needs to have done so knowingly and willingly of the outcome. Given that it's a risk assessment being done by these leaderships, this isn't the case, and they did so based on those aspects of character which we said were essential for a commander, and were all done not in line with this assessment. Further, it could be argued that our analysis of the practical imperative doesn't hold in the case, because in the verbiage of the practical imperative, they must use somebody as a mere means in order for it to be immoral, and it could be argued that the government didn't use the POWs as a mere means because they shared the same ends with the United States government. Both of them wanted the same results of the war. However, given this aspect of consent, a POW or any military member in that sense cannot consent to any action or moral decision that would mitigate their humanity or diminish their value as a moral agent, thus nullifying that objection. The third would be that our application of the greatest happiness principle wasn't on a big enough scope. The argument here being that the freeing of the POWs and all these military actions taken by the government don't actually bring the greatest happiness to the world at large. And in the aspect of our case, this is a moot point because freeing of the POWs doesn't directly correlate with United States military operations. It's just freeing the POWs, and as a result, the military operations of the United States doesn't need that broad of an assessment for addressing the moral obligations of this case specifically. So we'll now open up the floor for any questions the judges may have. Yes, sir.
At the risk of perhaps oversimplifying your presentation, which I thought was very good, let me see if I understand this. What the prisoners, the POWs, did as it related to the escape attempt was okay.
Yes, sir.
But do you consider the other communications gathering, if you will, do you consider that to fall under the realm of spying? And if so, why? And if not, why not?
Yes, sir, we would consider that the information that's being relayed back to the CIA and all that through those means would be considered spying in that case, because these aspects of like relaying military information, you could take a look at it pretty objectively that these POWs are inside enemy territory. The enemy doesn't know this true status of what they're doing, and they're relaying intelligence, such as the bomb targets as a specific example, and other things behind enemies' back as a form of espionage, making them spies.
So philosophically and morally, what they did was wrong, but as a practical matter, what's your opinion?
Only in the case that it was information that they were relaying that was not an attempt for an escape, or not in aid to an escape attempt. Therefore, all of this information that was only for military operations, such as bomb targets, that was not going to help them escape, that is what we are saying is specifically espionage and specifically not morally and ethically okay.
So they did the wrong thing, but the result of that was that they were putting their fellow prisoners in more danger and more risk of harm.
Yes, sir. And the United States could have perhaps gone about other means of gathering that same information through military operations and military intelligence outside of the POWs to gather the same information without putting them in that harm.
And this is where we see a bit of a rift between the moral theory and the legal theory, especially pertaining to this particular example. Because legally, espionage is defined as clandestine communication in enemy territory. That's the definition in the legal sense. So even though they might be communicating about an escape attempt, legally it's still considered espionage. So one thing I didn't mention when we were talking about Articles 3 and 4 is that when we're making these risk assessments and we're partaking in this legal sense of espionage, then we have to balance, okay, are we communicating so that we can escape and get out of here? Or are we communicating to send Washington coordinates to bomb targets, troop movements, and all this other intelligence, right? Because if you're communicating offensive information that can be used offensively against the North Vietnamese, then you can argue that you're putting your comrades at more risk, right? Because you're communicating more likelihood to get caught, and then more likelihood to be beaten after this.
But I think one could also argue that that's more of a, in my mind anyway, that's more of a form of resistance than it is spying. That's just my opinion.
Yeah.
Can I follow up on that and ask you, did the United States government task them for that information?
Right.
Or did the prisoners put forward? Stockdale's example of the radio station. Why the radio station? Because they're pumping in 24/7 propaganda into the prison. So morale boost to that. So is there a difference in your argument on moral obligation and fault if the prisoners are offering the information elements of their own volition in their clandestine communication as part of their resistance to stay in the war effort?
Yes, sir, and we addressed this partially, but I'll go into more detail about that aspect of consent. So these military members, in your case, they are consenting to give this information. However, this is with the fact that they are being deprived of their humanity to make this decision for a prolonged amount of time. So by continuing to give this information, which isn't directly pertinent to the escape, they're subjecting themselves to more torture, more harm, and yes, it gives them purpose, as military men to do that. However, morally, they shouldn't make a decision that would deprive them of their humanity, in essence, which is what's going on in the case of the Hanoi Hilton prisoner.
In addition to that, while they are providing the information freely and without being tasked by the government, the information is coming at the risk of, causing more harm in the event that there would be more, a morale boost and more communication between each other and provide them with more purpose. However, you saw that that same purpose and drive was coming from just merely communicating with each other through tapping on walls and having that form of communication. We saw once they were all put into one room together, just having communications between one another boosted their morale and gave them more purpose and having that camaraderie.
Let me press on that. So prior to going into the room, the fact that they did tap code to try to figure out who was there makes them spies, because they're using clandestine communication.
Legally.
Therefore, they lose their right and should be executed.
Right, but however,
Okay, right.
Sir.
Okay, are you sure?
No, sir. So this goes back to the non-combatant immunity argument and how that Barnett stated that the North Vietnamese were already not following these principles. So waiving that right doesn't really matter because they're already being tortured. And so even if it was like a command to execute spies or something like that, they're not following that rule anyways. And given the immediate risk of the fact that they are being tortured, then it's okay for them to do this.
Okay, so if I whisper to my friend, which is clandestine communication between us, by your argument, I'm still revoking because I don't want the enemy to hear what I have.
So,
What you're saying?
so, sir, in the legal sense, that is what's going on. So if you're a POW in this camp and you're thinking, if I ever make it out of here and we ever win this war and we ever take the North Vietnamese to international court for these violations, then I shouldn't be whispering. However, you're being beaten, you're being tortured, you're starved, right? You're malnourished. There are a lot of other considerations as a human that goes into this. So even though you're legally engaging in espionage, at the same time, it's something that's more of a human action.
And ethically, there was, like I said, under use and Bella principles, there was little distinction from the side of the North Vietnamese between combatant and non-combatant. Actually, the distinction between the two was non-existent. Therefore, waiving their non-combatant status had a minimal effect because they were going to be treated the same no matter what.
Okay, final question for each of you. Have you memorized the code of conduct? Do you know it by heart?
At one time, yes. On the spot right now, if you ask me to recite it,
I won't do that.
I think I would miss some punctuations in a few articles, or not articles, but like B, A's.
Okay, next cadet.
No,
Please
sir.
solve it.
and again, answering truthfully, I have in the past, and I have been able to recite it clearly, directly, and accurately. At this point, I could tell you 3 and
No.
4, but
Oh, I agree.
Yeah,
Okay,
well,
thank
Same
you.
thing.
Don't feel like the
Something
Lone
to-
Ranger.
Yeah, you're not the Lone Ranger, but something you and your airmen need to know, because nobody's gonna hand it to you if you end up that way.
absolutely.
Okay, thank you.
Go ahead.
Thanks, sir. How many times did you all change your mind in arguments on this back and forth? Because I like the argument and counter argument.
Well, I think, sir, the better question would be, when did you solidify your argument? And I would say, I mean, we most of this presentation, truthfully, was just us discussing for like the past 2 weeks, just meeting for hours and just having really in-depth conversations about the minutiae details. Solidifying our argument was very difficult, and it was extremely hard, especially considering each philosophy professor that we'd bring in would have new minutiae, new details, new things to think about. So it was, I don't know if we even had a clear argument to even like go back and forth on this.
I just think it's
coming
very
to that-
difficult.
Yeah, so coming to that conclusion, then we, bringing in different professors from our department, we would have questions being brought up and counter arguments being brought up. And then at that point, it was just, how do we apply it to the decision that we've come to in our argument and, dissuade the counter argument.
So you asked the professors in the department, did you ask anybody that had been in combat?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Some of the professors had been in combat. Some of them were officers that were deployed and served.
And
in
at this point, after studying this, what do you think you would choose to do?
Sir, and that's an interesting question, because going back to the arguments and counter arguments, going after immediately reading the case in our first meeting, we all had a lot of differing opinions. For example, I would have personally as the leader, executed on the escape plan following the signal from the SR-71s, which brought us a lot of more negotiation to the case, because I was looking at it more from an objective lens, and that's why I helped a lot with the practical imperative and the other deontological arguments, which are based on assertions and not necessarily calculations of risk or results.
And
So,
I was looking at it through a lens of how are we going to get the men home, and how are we going to get them home safely in the most humane way. And I think so. Looking at that not only through potentially canceling escape plans, but continuing morale and keeping that up, because a man can come home, but he might not be
Well,
safe.
and the more difficult aspect of this is the number of women that are now going to be in combat with them. So having commanded both in combat, there's some real challenges that this is going to be fun to think through.
And in our research, even at the Hanoi Hilton, there were 4 women there. So that does, if you're commanding those women, it does kind of change the calculus with different considerations. The part that bothered me the most while I was reading this and trying to figure out how I want to make my argument is that, did Stockdale do the right thing? Because before he said we need 2 criteria. We need a pretty decent chance of escape, and we need outside help. He had a pretty decent chance of escape, and he also had the guarantee from the US government in the form of the 2 sonic booms. But, so I couldn't see why he would cancel it, but also now looking back, there was bad weather at the extraction point at the mouth of the river, right? When the Navy SEALs even lost his life because of the bad weather, and when they jumped out, he impacted too hard. So with all these details, not knowing, I learned a lot from Stockdale's decision, because he probably took that from.
How would you characterize probability and risk? High risk, high probability, high risk, low probability of success for their escape attempt?
I would say due to low ability to communicate back and forth, communication is really predominantly one way. It would be high risk and low potentiality to actually
Of
actualize.
success for that?
And that's
What if-
another, I'm sorry. That was another thing that was in contention, was the amount of limited information that both sides had. We had POWs who had limited information on what was going on outside, and the means they had to escape with the help of the US government. Also, the US government had limited information based on how much communication the POWs were allowed to have and what was going on inside. And even transportation between different camps. The prisoners were taken to different camps and moved all over. So having that limited information, being able to assess the situation on your end and knowing what's going to be best for the POWs, not only in your camp, but also in other camps. You have so many more levels to look at, and the U.S. government is looking at it very broadly.
And
Risk and probability of the success on the attempt? How would you characterize risk and probability on the effects on prisoners?
Definitely a high risk. And also, kind of like I said, looking at it from a consequentialist point of view, hindsight is 20/20. So now we're able to look back and see what happened, and that they were able to escape, and that it was resolved. However, back then you don't know. You're in a prison cell, and therefore it's everything you do is high risk, especially tapping on walls, potentially allowing the Vietnamese to know that everybody's communicating with each other. So therefore, your tapping could have grave consequences for the other 600 prisoners.
And I think there was, Stockdale kind of had this high risk of damage if the escape attempt occurred, or failed, sorry, because he knew that there was that previous escape attempt, and he knew that it failed because those prisoners were transferred to the Hanoi Hilton afterward, and they were constantly shuffling in and out. So he, very reasonably, we can say that he heard these stories, he knew what happened afterward. So in his mind, there was probably a high chance of something going wrong and everyone in the Hanoi Hilton being punished for it.
Not just punishment, loss of life.
Yes, sir.
Plus the other prison camps.
Yes. Okay. Thank you. No criticism in my questions. This is great presentation discussion.
Very difficult subject. Thank you. Well done.
How many escape attempts or planned escapes, going in and releasing prisoners, do you think were attempted during the Vietnam War?
I'd have to assume tens of escapes, if not hundreds, given the fact that these men.
Let me put it differently. How many were successful?
You would have to,
So the very fact that no matter what information you have, this is a very risky thing to do. You're in the middle of the biggest city in your enemy's territory, going in against them. There's this radio transmitter over there, and yeah, it's broadcasting, but it can do other things. The presumption that it might not be a military target, I think, is maybe not the right one. You want to take out as much stuff you can that it'll have the potential for impact, because you also might want to use it for as a detraction or a distraction, to have them point in a different direction. I think the interesting one where you talk about is it's escape only. Use the information for escape only. It's okay to do espionage as long as it's related to escape. But I'm not sure you always know that. How would you know that? Wouldn't you like to kind of know what it's called the intelligence preparation of the battlefield? You don't know what pieces out there are going to relate, so you get as many of them as you can.
Well, then that would
Does
be.
that change your thinking in it at all? I mean,
Sir, for this specific case,
Yeah.
it wouldn't change our thinking because we're able to know the facts of like the information, everything they relate after the fact. But more as like a hypothetical for POWs in war, our argument is centered on the idea of what ought to be done, what ought to be thought about before that. So the information, if they could, hypothetically, know exactly where their intelligence is going to, we said it would be wrong then if it didn't directly pertain to the escape.
And
But we understand how difficult that could be to actually calculate.
Furthermore, if they had a reasonable suspicion that this information they were relaying would aid in an escape attempt, we would say that that is information that's morally and ethically okay to be corresponding to the U.S. Or with each other because it was in an effort to lead to an escape attempt. So therefore, that information, if they think it's going to be helpful, is completely morally and ethically okay. We're saying that information that was only going to aid in military operations, that was extraneous to any escape attempt, that is what is morally and ethically not okay.
And I understand also the situation doesn't allow you the full knowledge of information that you're gathering and the purpose it's going to be used for. And I think using, reasonable assessment of the situation and the information you're gathering and that you know of, and understanding, thinking through the possibilities of how it would be used to get you out of an escape. And in the case that you assess and it does come out to having a high chance of helping you in escape, then that again is morally and ethically.
It's an after the fact that you find out whether it was morally or ethically done. It's quite hard to do that.
Right, absolutely.
That's why we're looking at it from a consequentialist perspective.
And you don't know what's swimming in that river.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, you do.
Piranha.
That's
One
the
of the
moral
snakes.
obligation of the US government to keep faith, to keep trying, to keep reaching out, to keep trying to communicate. And does that have a morale factor and a success that contributes to military operations, your last point?
Yes, sir. So if the government is reaching out explicitly for military information that they know isn't going to help these prisoners escape, then we would say there's not a moral obligation for the government to do that type of clandestine communication. Again, the moral obligation on the government side would lie on reaching out to these men for the purpose of escaping, because they're already being subject to so much harm and inhumane treatment that if the government and anyone making these decisions is saying, okay, well, we know you guys are being tortured, but can you give us like something over here and not say anything about the escape plan, we're saying that would be morally wrong.
And in terms of morale, if the U.S. government is reaching out, seeking information, and not not gathering information to try to help these prisoners get out of the situation that they're in, it's a sort of dehumanizing effect of understanding that if they don't mean anything to their government, then what are they doing there? If they're not having information to come home.
First slide, second bullet. First bullet was U.S. government moral obligation for clandestine comms. What was the second one? I forgot. forgot, if you want to go back to your first slide, please.
Sorry. Is it here?
Believe so.
Or, it might be the bluff at the very beginning.
Because Connectoresi was, did I say that correctly?
Yes, sir.
Brought it out. So it was the U.S. government moral obligation to support clandestine communications, and there was another bullet that I want to carry.
Yeah, so the second one was just the flip side of that they don't have that moral obligation for communication that didn't directly aid in their escape.
Why would they not have the moral obligation?
So just like we were talking
I
about,
was trying to listen to that, yeah.
yeah, so just like from the previous question, so from a moral perspective, by getting this information that's just for military operations, but not helping the men get out of the dire situation that they're in, that's as cadet.
They're putting
Wing
undue
said.
harm on the prisoners in
Roger,
cases
because of the
that-
information that's
Right.
being
Yes, sir,
collected.
without helping them
Got it.
escape.
Right.
Yeah.
Well,
Okay.
so continuing question there is, how do you know? And that's what intelligence preparation of the battlefield is all about. You don't know which piece of the information is going to be directly applied. So you get as much information as you can about the local area, about the communications, about the radio tower, where the airfield is, whatever you can find out. Because you're going to try to insert U.S. forces into a hostile territory, you better know what's going on.
Yeah.
And you don't know which piece you're going to be using.
And this
Okay.
is.
That's the last question too, thank you.
Am I able to?
Yeah.
Yes, please.
Okay, in response, looking at the proportionality side, the US government had other means to gather information.
What were they?
CIA was working with them and just intelligence agencies that we had that weren't putting the POWs at more risk, things like that.
So reconnaissance planes, special forces and operators going in and surveying it, so there were other ways to do it, not just using the POW.
You would think that they would have taken that into consideration before tasking the POWs. And did. So, you don't, hypothetically, you probably wouldn't task them for things that you couldn't get some other way. And if you didn't know, we're pretty good about that. We don't send spies in to find out stuff that we know from other pieces. We don't risk ships, we don't risk airplanes. We can find it some other way.
Sir, plus, kind of like I said, if they're gathering that information to help them escape or to help provide a means to escape, then it's absolutely necessary to escape, and that is completely morally and ethically okay on both the United States' side to ask for that information, the POW side to provide that information.
And perhaps as a counter argument, sir, the government knew this analysis of how they could get the intelligence. However, they weighed that the prisoners were already in so much risk that they didn't want to risk more men, and so they were okay with prolonging their suffering,
Is that what their process of thinking was?
We don't know, but this is obviously a bleak way of theorizing it.
Yeah, no, you're right. I mean,
yeah.
that could be.
And along that lines, that's why we say it. That wouldn't be moral.
Got it.
Well, thank you, Air Force, round of applause.
Yeah, absolutely.
Nicely done.
Thank you very much.
It's actually been-
Thank you.
Good job, guys.